Hi, and welcome to our channel. This is I Think I Love My Job. Thank you for joining us today. If you don't know me, I am Kalifa, the resident expert on all things employee experience for Deep Dive, and I look forward to these sessions with you. What are we going to talk about? How do you build a survey? Let's go. So because I do so much work in the employee listening space and continuous listening space, I often get questions about surveys. Surveys are one of the easiest ways to collect a lot of data at one time from across your organization, especially in mass in terms of questions. It's usually the most efficient thing to do and the most efficient tool. It often is always good too if you really need it done quickly. So the issue a lot of people have is you have a survey to do, but you're not sure where to start. You don't know what items you need to choose, you don't know what scale needs to go with which items, or if you should choose a particular scale. You don't know if you should do it, if a vendor should do it, you just don't know. The other thing is you might have already run a survey and here comes the data and it makes no sense to you, or it doesn't seem to be saying anything. So I'm here to walk you through with some tips and tricks, things to really pay attention to when you are ready to write a survey. There are two people who are extremely important when you are designing any tool for people to respond to. The person who's responding to it and the person who's going to analyze the data. Two very different people, very different goals, but very, very important. Know thy audience. Rule to live by. You need to know their educational level. You need to know what they do, how they talk, what is their industry lingo. You need to also know things like how much time do they have. So for example, if you're considering time off the floor, for a frontline employee, you need to probably have a shorter survey because time off the floor costs the business money. The other person is the analyst. In a lot of cases, the analyst is exactly the same person who designed the survey. But that person needs to be thinking about, when I put this survey out, how is the data going to come back? Will it make sense? And will it meet the goals that I have? Which leads me to be very clear what your goals are. What do you really want to know? Ask what you really want to know. A survey doesn't have to be tricky. It's not a test. It's not the same as an assessment that you will do for selection. You are trying to collect information and you want it to be as accurate as possible. It's not a puzzle. It's not circle. It just needs to be clear and concise. Be very clear. Are you asking about stress? Are you asking about happiness, but you really mean satisfaction? Then ask about satisfaction. If you want to know how important something is versus the frequency of use, then just ask how important it is. It is really, really important that you be very, very clear on what your goals are, how you plan to report it, before you start putting pen to paper. Now let's talk about developing items. Developing items seems like it should be an easy task, but it obviously is not, right? Anybody who's really tried it has probably banged their head on the table at least once trying to think of what the right thing to do is. Part of the challenge is because you want to ask everything that you need to ask in as few questions as possible, which is related to the last point. Be very clear what you're trying to ask. You also want to make sure that you're asking one thing at a time. No matter how much it seems like those two things are related, you should not ask the same thing. You should ask them as two separate questions, right? So if you want to ask, for example, and this is a silly example, but very basic, this cake was rich and moist. Not the same thing, right? So you would ask two questions. Or you will choose which one of those two characteristics is more important to you. You really need to not ask double-barreled questions and not ask double negative questions. It should be very clear. You also don't want to keep switching with items. You don't want to keep switching to I never, I have, I never, I have. You might have seen it done in other surveys, but this brings us to our first point. Remember the analyst of the survey and remember the respondent. You don't want both sides having a lot of room for error because you keep switching up what you're asking and how you're asking it. It could mess up the data that you get. Another thing that is super duper important is your scale. I get a lot of questions about scales. Usually most sentiment surveys are agreement scales, strongly agree to strongly disagree, but you've got to be really careful about what scale you're using, and it should match the item. So I've actually seen examples of somebody really wanting to know frequency, how much do you do something, and the answer or the scale for the answer is strongly agree to strongly disagree, which makes absolutely no sense. The other thing with a scale is a scale doesn't have to be a 10-point scale if a 5-point scale will do. Unless you have a statistical reason for doing it, like you need the increased variance, it's really not something you should do. Sometimes you might do it because that is just typical of the scale. So for example, with NPS, it could run from 0 to 10, and in some cases 1 to 10. So you want to keep that because it's familiar. So I always tell people, be really careful. The other thing, and I spoke about it a little earlier, is not reversing these scales a lot. You do that, you are creating room for all types of errors. You don't want to do that, and you also don't want to keep changing the scale throughout the survey a lot. Try to keep all the items that have similar scales together and only change the scale as little as possible. The key is to remember that you want your respondents to use as little cognitive energy as possible, focusing on your format, and you want them to use as much as possible answering your question clearly. You don't want them to have to stop to think, to try to figure it out, because then you're more likely to get bad data going in, and it could be extremely frustrating for that person to take the survey. Honorable mention for this video is response rates. I get a lot of questions about response rates. So, what is a good response rate? I often joke, any response rate is good, but in a lot of corporate surveys, you'll find that you'll get 10 to 15% response rates. A lot. It's not bad. You can use it, especially when they're not high stakes surveys. You do hope to get about 30%. When you're at 30%, you can breathe a lot of the time when you are trying to make a decision. Now, for big surveys that have heavy investment, you often find like 90% response rates for like annual surveys. That is normal. Something I do want to stress, however, don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out why people did not take your survey. You can't figure it out. It's often not homogeneous reasons. It could be a reason as simple as I forgot, to a reason that's complex as this is a protest, I hate you. So you can't assign a reason. You can't spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. You don't know. If you are very concerned, then my recommendation is, if this is an identified survey, to find non-responders and do a research project trying to understand why they won't respond. I talked about this a little bit, but I know I gotta talk about it here for sure. The difference between an anonymous survey and a confidential survey. A lot of times they use interchangeably, but I want to make it clear they are not. And there are ethics involved in using one word versus the other. So you have to be very, very careful about what you do. And you have to remember that you have to write the proper disclaimers on your surveys, because you need to protect the people taking the survey and the organization. An anonymous survey is one that cannot be identified at all. It is just sent out. It's an anonymous link. You can't track who sent it. And if you want any sort of demographic information, you need to ask it on the survey. The drawback of doing that survey for an organization is you often cannot do enough cuts and comparisons that can help you have a more robust reporting or more robust reports. And so what happens is you can't necessarily make the best decisions on anonymous data. When you ask for demographic data, it helps a little, but once you're asking for self-report of demographics, you just open the door for mistakes and even lying. So you want to be very careful about that. Confidential surveys for organizations, that is usually the sweet spot. Confidential surveys can be identified and traced back to the person who took the survey. And usually with confidential surveys, people who have the ability to see the full data set are usually a small group of analysts, or even sometimes one analyst and perhaps a vendor. With confidential surveys, you can do a lot more cuts and demographics using existing data that already exists within HR systems. It also makes it easier to distribute and report. Now, the one thing that you have to pay attention to is, one, not only who has access to that data, but if you have team level reporting, you want to make sure that if you have teams, and I recommend with less than 5 responses, they should not get a report, because you want to do everything to protect the identities of everybody who take your survey. They trust you. You've got to do the right thing, and it's also the ethical thing to do. Before I forget, should you ask open text questions? My response to that, yes, 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 yes. Qualitative data usually allows you to find out more about what's going on outside of what closed-ended questions can give you. It also allows you to get further information that you may not be aware of, and it allows you to expand the confines of your own personal bias when writing the tool. I strongly recommend it. I think that it's the best thing to do. However, with this caveat, if you have no intention to do anything with the open text questions, don't ask it, because the energy that it takes for somebody to write it and to trust you, they really want you to do something with it. You really need to do something with it. You can do NLP modeling on it. You could do theme and sentiment analysis on it. There's so much you can do, and it's so robust, that type of data. But if you do not intend to do anything with it, don't even bother. So we'll talk about another time the types of tools and software that you can and should use depending on what you want to do. Also, a question I get is about vendors. Should you use a vendor? Should you write it yourself? We'll talk about that on another session. This is it. So just let me know if you have any comments or concerns or ideas in the comments. I will be happy to read it and happy to hear your ideas. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this and like what you see in here, please go ahead and subscribe. Thank you for joining me. I am always happy to have you. It's always a pleasure. And I want to remind you that there's always room to have a brilliant experience.